The Ladies' World, later titled The Woman's World, is a significant journal because it is a periodical dedicated largely to women's fashion, style, and society. It is also an interesting study because Oscar Wilde was the journal's most notable figure, although this fact should complement rather than overshadow the journal's contributions. Wilde is such a prominent figure who is often larger than life, particularly when one discusses his career in the late 1880s and early 1890s. That he edited this journal inevitably increased the magazine's notoriety. He also did so at a time when he was growing in prominence among the writing community. During his time as the editor of Woman's World, Wilde wrote some of his most prominent stories, including The Picture of Dorian Gray. Most of the scholarship about this title centers on Wilde. This is natural because Wilde is the most prominent, relatable, and famous writer of the later 19th century. One could also argue that many of the changes that made the magazine well known and successful are directly linked to Wilde. All of these points are valid, and I will account for them as I progress. But I also want to focus on the journal as a whole, taking note of its objective journalistic qualities and its prominence in the women's periodical marketplace. In short, I wish to examine the title from a more woman's world perspective than the traditional Wilde-centric examinations that occur in scholarship. Articles like Anya Clayworth's The Woman's World, Oscar Wilde as Editor, or Oscar Wilde's The Woman's World by Stephanie Green are strong contributions to this discussion. I believe that Wilde's involvement has been well documented, and I want to explore the title's other merits. The Ladies' World began as a monthly publication in 1886 as a woman's social magazine. It centered primarily on women's fashion at this time. This focus was significant insofar as many of the other women's periodicals of this time had moved away from clothing, fashion, and society. Instead, they concentrated on prominent social issues such as women's education, women's place in society, and gender relations. Thomas Wemyss Reid edited The Ladies' World for the first few months of the magazine's existence. He had already been manager of Cassell & Company, which published The Woman's World. He was a natural fit to edit the new title, or so they thought. Under his leadership, the magazine targeted upper-class women and the occasional woman from the middle classes. Priced at 1 shilling per issue, the magazine could cater only to this market. So even if the contents accommodated this demographic, the price alone would deter those of the lower classes from purchasing the periodical. The magazine's focus on fashion, marriages, fashionable balls, foreign dress, and the latest trends placed it on the periphery of its contemporaries. It catered to an esoteric market, both in price and in content, and one may conclude that the initial aims were too narrow to succeed. It was disconnected from the current discussion about women. The early issues did not have their finger on the pulse of contemporary discussions or the issues which truly mattered to their demographic. While many women could appreciate a focus on fashion, culture, and household items, how many were willing to spend 1 shilling per month to get this information? Official circulation numbers are unknown, but it is unlikely that they were very high. Before 6 months were out, concerns arose about the magazine's longevity. Unique is not always a recipe for success in the publishing world, and the early returns of the Ladies' World reflected this idea perfectly. By the end of the first few months, it was evident that the magazine had to reevaluate its approach if it wanted to continue. According to Nowell-Smith, Cassell stated that the magazine had, quote, attained a recognized and unique position at the head of its class, but this was evidently not enough. It was at the head of its class in what it did, but it was the only publication in that market. It was like the Ladies' World occupied a parallel track to other women's publications for the first year of its life. The markets could not intersect and would not intersect, and the Ladies' World was on its own path while its readership was more interested in the other path. By the time that Wilde took over editorial responsibilities, the magazine had fallen out of fashion, so to speak, among the highbrow audiences that it attracted. This is when Oscar Wilde came on board and proposed changes. He and the publishers were able to create a hybridized version of the Ladies' World which integrated the magazine's integrity while broadening its scope so that it included feminist discussions. The November 1887 issue featured a name change from The Ladies' World to The Woman's World. The title change was more than nominal. The attractive woodcuts in the engravings remained, as did the notes on fashion and dress. The new magazine, however, expanded its horizons. Whereas The Ladies' World insinuated notions of upper-class prestige and esoteric notions of beauty, Woman's World accommodated a broader audience to include all women, including those of the upper class that it targeted. Woman's World incorporated more of the women's thoughts and attitudes of the time. It encompassed more political and social aspects of life as a Victorian woman. The name change, according to Clayworth, was proposed not by Wilde, but rather it was presented by the contributors, especially the women who resented the term ladies because it was too narrow-minded. As Clayworth explains, quote, "The term woman described the adult female with no reference to social class, but with reference to the new woman who was politically involved in the woman question." With the name change, more feminist contributors were willing to write for the publication, and it became something that they were proud of. The magazine began to contemplate women's social roles at the turn of the century, and how they fit into both private and public spheres. The magazine became a space for literature and social discussion as well. It wasn't a magazine of cultural vanity anymore. Literary notes, book reviews, and feminist contributions became the magazine's defining characteristics, with some notes on cross-dressing and aesthetics sprinkled in. Strachan and Nally also argue that the magazine undertook a form of Irishness once Wilde took over. They explain that the magazine is a good example of how the Irish were marketed in English culture. While these sentiments are worth considering, researchers should be cautious about such blanket statements. Wilde had contributed to English periodicals long before this and even embarked on an American tour. To attribute his Irishness to a periodical may be imposing meaning where there is none. May also problematize people's study of the journal because this lens does not reflect the title's primary feminist goals. Getting too fixated on Wilde and biography can skew the study of the journal as it is. The Woman's World was unquestionably an English publication which may have circulated in New York and Paris. Chances are that people recognized it as a publication from London by a growing artist and a host of strong female contributors, rather than from an Irish writer who infiltrated an English market. Many prominent women, many of whom were at the forefront of late Victorian discussions about women, contributed to the Women's World. Emily Crawford, who was known as the Queen of Journalists with an exemplary reputation in the field, contributed to its pages. She spent much time abroad as a foreign correspondent who reported on political strife, social issues, and war. Feminism was not her primary concern, but she made great inroads for women as a political correspondent. She helped to make these journalistic outlets, very public professions, fashionable and acceptable for women to do. Millicent Garrett Fawcett, who is now known for her work as a suffragist, contributed to the Woman's World. Her contributions to the Woman's World come as she resurrected her career after her husband's death led to a temporary hiatus. Around this time, Fawcett began getting more involved with politics, Irish Home Rule, and the woman question. Mary Frances Billington was another prominent journalist who contributed to the Woman's World. She had already established a prominent reputation as a journalist by reporting events and discussing social concerns which did not usually include women. It was around this time of her contributions to the magazine that she focused more intently on making more discussions, professions, and events available for women. Mary Louise Arome, whose pseudonym was Ouida, was an established novelist and confidant of Oscar Wilde by the time she contributed to the Woman's World. Her involvement with such a magazine is quite fitting, given that she had expensive tastes. She wrote extensively about racy subjects, animals, and London society, which made her a natural fit for the journal's goals. Violet Fane was a literary pseudonym for Beres Mary Curry. Curry was a prominent public figure who had already established a strong literary reputation in the community. Despite a successful name change and a shift in scope, the Woman's World ceased publication in October 1890. It failed largely because it was priced too high. Although it was designed as a fashionable magazine for upper-class women who could afford the periodical, 1 shilling per month was a steep price to pay for such fashion advice. Wilde also started to lapse in his editorial duties around this time. When he took over as editor of the magazine, he published literary notes and reviews quite frequently, but as time wore on and the magazine's diversity diminished, he stopped contributing as much. This does not mean that the journal wasn't an important title for the women's marketplace. It was, but it limited its market simply by its scope, and it was priced beyond the threshold of what its market could endure. Its early demise makes it difficult to evaluate the magazine's legacy. On one hand, the journal did not last very long and was simply part of many women's journals published at this time. On the other hand, Woman's World offered something more than these other women's magazines by blending old and new traditions in a hybrid that accommodated both women's fashion and women's society. Many of its contributors were women, and these women had a prominent voice in the late 19th century publishing industry. So it's really difficult to narrow down what the Woman's World and the Ladies' World meant to late Victorian publishing. But I do think that we've only started to plumb the depths of this journal, and I think that it has a lot more to offer as a research subject. Thanks for listening.